Breaking the cycle to step forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris and Beverley Ann.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward podcast with myself, Chris, my lovely co-host,
Beverley Ann. Hello.
And we have a fantastic guest with us today, Lisa Malangone. I'm sure you're going to tell me that I've just pronounced that wrong. So please go ahead and tell me I have pronounced that wrong, Lisa.
No, Chris, you did a great job. I actually really enjoyed the way you said it. So thank you. Hi, everyone.
Okay. So welcome. And you are from YeSheTherapies. And when I first saw that, I said, YeShe. So,
you won't be the first. You won't be the last.
What does YeShe actually mean, Lisa?
So YeShe is actually a Tibetan word that means wisdom. And in my practice, I really try and work with finding people's own inner wisdom, because I believe that we have it all within us. And it's about trying to support people to bring it out. Yeah.
I love that, Bev, don't you?
Absolutely. And I might use those words, own inner wisdom, because I say the word self-care, but it means the same thing. And for some people that doesn't resonate with them because and I say it's a challenging thing to learn, but that sounds beautiful, your own inner wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So, Lisa, can you tell everyone a little bit about your childhood, your adolescence, your early adulthood, just so we can get a flavour of who you are and maybe why you went into the career of therapies in the first place? Because usually there's a bit of a backstory there. Only share what you're comfortable with, of course, and yeah, let's go from there.
Okay. So, how did I get into this? Well, I think, like any counsellor, I think we're called the wounded healers for a reason. And I think there's always something that draws you to it, wanting to support other people. And for me, I came from a very sort of middle class, what you would call probably idyllic childhood. And, in many ways, it's very good, very healthy. But I think as I grew up, I realised that there were some dynamics that were probably less healthy than they could have been. And they had an impact on things like my self-esteem and the way I operated in the world, and I had ideas and narratives based around that. So what took me into therapy? So I when I left university, I actually started working in research. So I was doing qualitative research, a lot of government research. We did all sorts of research. It was lovely because it was really talking to people, getting to understand them, getting to know the way they thought that they, the reasons they think the way they do, and looking at behaviours. And yeah, it was really interesting. But then I found sometimes it was frustrating, because that would get written into a report that would end up on a dusty shelf somewhere. And we'd feel like, actually, we've found all this stuff out, but what's actually happening as a result of that? We had no control over that. And sometimes we felt a bit frustrated. So I decided that actually I wanted to do a little bit more to support people. So rather than just talking them to find out information, that I wanted to support people to move forward in their own lives, as well as just, find out about them. So I retrained when I was in my mid-20s. So after 10 years of working in research, I retrained and I became a counsellor and a psychotherapist. And yeah, that's where it all started, really.
What kinds of counsellor did you become? Because there's all kinds of different types of counsellors, and we've all probably been to the person where we talking therapies, for example, that are not trauma informed or not person centered or are not long term in their delivery. So what can you tell us about your journey as a counsellor?
Yes, lots of different modalities, and I think sometimes it can be a bit confusing or baffling for people to know what they all are. And the sort of NHS just generically tends to offer things like CBT or short-term intervention. So the modality I practice is actually an integrative therapy. So what that means is that it combines a number of different models. So I can work with clients in different ways. So it will be humanistic, it will be person-centered, but it will also include some CBT, but it's all within a transpersonal framework. Now that's a sort of,
I was going to say, what does that word actually mean?
Yeah, exactly. Good question. So transpersonal just means anything that's kind of beyond us. So, some people might say there's a spiritual perspective. Some people might say it's kind of an interrelational dynamics. So I do work with things like transactional analysis or psychodynamics. That's much more about sort of the traditional model. But the way transpersonal fits into that is we're looking at things like, is there a bigger meaning here? Is there something that's trying to come through? Is there some reason for some of this that's happening in our lives, or the dynamics or patterns that exist? And can we do something with those in order to support ourselves? So it's kind of looking for bigger pictures.
Could you give us an example off the top of your head? Because it's still hard for us to tap into for some of us that haven't quite found out inner wisdom.
Yeah, well, and I think where we have to be really careful with this stuff is that sometimes it can be a bit advanced in terms of it's too much for people where they're at in that moment. And in those cases, we just hold it lightly as a kind of a framework or a reference. But ultimately, what we're looking to find is, are we being supported in some way by the experiences that we're having in order to grow psychologically, spiritually, so that we can move forward? That's what it's ultimately saying. And that can be a really, really hard thing to hear if you've been through something very traumatic or very difficult, or if you're in the midst of something very difficult. But there are many, many clients that I've worked with, or groups of people that I've worked with, where they can actually come to a point where they can look back and go, well, actually, this thing that happened actually shifted the direction of my life. And it meant that this thing could come. I cleared the way for something else to come through, or something happened as a result of that, which actually ended up being beneficial or useful for them. And it doesn't always go there, but very often it does. And that's what we're kind of holding and looking for. Is there greater meaning or purpose within the experiences that they're having?
And that is something that's challenging at times, because when we're feeling overwhelmed and when it's all become so much and we're very much in that fight or flight, there isn't much capacity to take on board anything else. And I think what's really lovely about what you're saying is it's just holding people, because let's be honest, sometimes we just want to be held in a space that is like, I can breathe, I'm being heard, and I don't have to vocalize actually every single thing.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's not holding, is there a greater meaning or purpose in this? It's holding, can I hold the idea that this person does actually have the resources and capacity to cope and to become resilient in their life, even though right now they don't believe it or they can't see it. So we're holding that concept, because we're not doing it to them, we're just supporting them to do it for themselves. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's something that most people, and I know I hadn't years ago when I very first experienced it, have never had that opportunity, that nurturing, and it comes back down to the basics, doesn't it? It's the nurturing for whatever reason, because this isn't about finger pointing at different parents, etc., but different experiences impact people in different ways, and they're very scary at times, aren't they?
Absolutely. And that work that we do to sort of psychoeducate and to understand and to actually say, well, some of what you've experienced isn't okay and isn't what we class as normal, because people use the word normal all the time.
Yeah.
Even though it's a strange concept, but that actually it wasn't okay, it wasn't healthy, it wasn't right. And that work absolutely has to come first, until we have awareness, until we have understanding, and until that's been validated, because sometimes it's the first time it's ever been validated for them. Until that work is done and we've done the trauma recovery work, we absolutely can't bring any of this other work in. It's far too soon, and it would be triggering and probably traumatizing for people.
Absolutely. And especially with family dynamics, because I find that really interesting, because it's amazing how socially we had this concept of families, and sometimes it's an excuse. It's like, oh, well, they're your family. It doesn't matter about your values or your personal boundaries. Absolutely not. It still matters. Absolutely. But and being able to be in a space where somebody says, actually, yeah, I can understand why you're upset. I understand you love them, but I understand that it doesn't feel nice. And you've spoken about that yourself as well, Chris, haven't you?
Yeah, and there was something, the more and more I look at this, sometimes I get really confused. So I always thought I could look at a situation and think of it as black and white, really wrong or really right. But just because we don't see a particular individual's experience as abuse, because that is not our experience of abuse, if their emotional cup is not being fulfilled by a caregiver, they may see that as emotional neglect, whereas I might not see it as such, you might not see it as such, but who are we to tell somebody else what it is they're thinking or feeling? So even though we might not agree with it, it's not our thing to hold, it's their thing that they need to sort out because it's affecting their life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we're all operating from our own psyche and our own space, aren't we? And like you
Yeah,
say, some people will say, you know, if, especially if they've had experiences of something in their childhood, well, I'm not doing anything wrong because I'm not doing what was done to me. But
yeah,
like you said, that doesn't mean that, you know, for example, their children might not experience it in a traumatic way. It's just that
yeah,
it's obviously not as bad. Not that we compare, because it's not healthy
no,
to do that at
yeah,
all, because trauma is trauma at the end of the day, full stop. But in their mind, they're not doing anything wrong, and yet actually they are doing some damage, you know, and it's not on
yeah,
purpose necessarily.
no,
They're trying to be the best parent that they can be, but we're only able to operate from the place that where we've got to, you know, with the
yeah,
support and guidance we were offered and given. And of course it's our responsibility to further that as we get older and become adults, and we can do it, but that takes time, especially when we haven't been given that in childhood, you know. So we have to be kind to ourselves as well, that we're where we're at because of the experiences that we've had up until that point. And that we can always grow and continue that growth throughout our lives.
And as
yeah.
a new mum,
Sorry,
oh, sorry,
yes,
as a new mum, I was absolutely petrified of carrying through the impact of my own trauma. Um, but I didn't want to speak about it because I didn't want it coming into my family. But once I had my second child, I suddenly went into overdrive and thought, I need to deal with this, but not knowing. And it wasn't until they were a little bit older and they became teenagers, and I went to parenting classes as well, because I was, you know, this must be my fault. Do you see what I mean? And really taking it on board. But if I'd have heard about the trauma coming through beforehand, that I think would have been too much for me at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm a big believer in these things happen when they're meant to happen, you know, and when we're ready for it, our psyche won't ever allow us to go somewhere we're not ready for. We have to sort of trust that. But it can be anything. But often these big life events, like having a child or a relationship, can actually really bring up a lot for us. And you know, we're starting to see that we're doing things differently. And actually, well, what does that mean for me and what I did or didn't have as a child? And you know, our own inner child then gets triggered, doesn't it, by those
Yeah,
things? Yeah.
absolutely. Chris.
yeah. Just carrying on that conversation. That's exactly what happened to me, Lisa. I really wish that there would have been some literature available when I went to my GP for my prenatal checkups. And if I'd seen clearly, if you've been abused as a child, if you've witnessed domestic violence, you may be impacted by having your own child. I would have picked that up and I would have read it, rather than having my child, having all of that come up for me that you've just explained, then having a breakdown, and then being worried sick that if I went to seek help, that my children would be taken away from me through social services. So I really wish all of that information was available so that I could have got the help sooner rather than later for me personally. And there are still a lot of caregivers out there that have got their own trauma. They don't even know they've got it. They then have an addiction like drugs or alcohol, if that's their thing that helps them cope. And then their children are then growing up with a parent that's not there for them. So the cycle just continues. So there's a bit missing somewhere where we're not educating caregivers, potential caregivers, about if you've gone through this, you may be impacted, you may be dealing with it in this way. And in order for you to not harm your children because you can't give them what they need because you're wrapped up in your trauma, you're coping in the best way you can. There's that bit of education for me that's completely missing, because we only go and get help when we're in crisis, because we don't know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And sadly, that often happens, that people are in crisis at the point where they reach out for help. And there's so much self-blame and self-criticism that goes along with that. And that's, it's so hard for people to hold all of that when actually they're just doing the best that they can. And that's the compassion that we can hold towards people is, ultimately they're doing the best they can with what they were given.
Absolutely.
But I am sad that there is not more around this, because what we know is these big life events are massive indicators for things coming to the surface, so it is sad that there isn't more information available, and I mean, it does. I think midwives and mental health practitioners are much more aware of looking out for signs once people have had a child, and when they're doing their home visits and things like that, but it isn't always at that point. They're looking at things like postnatal depression, which of course we want to look out for and want to support. But when we're talking about the dynamics that we're talking about here, they very often come out later, when the children are a little bit older, for example. Because when they're babies, it's not coming out. It's coming out when they're toddlers, or when they're moving into sort of teenage years, or whenever it comes out. It's wherever we're feeling triggered. Whenever we're triggered by the stage of development that our child is at as well.
But by that time, we've been coping with whatever coping mechanisms that we are taking on board, and most of them are very negative. So I just think that there needs to be a whole research piece, an education piece on this, and then things put into place so that those of us that really wanted everything right for our children, and I think most caregivers do, unless, there are abusers themselves, then we should be able to access that without all of this angst that we go through before we can get the help and support that we deserve.
Yeah, and when we're looking at these kind of dynamics, it's also, understandably, people have trouble asking for help, because they've probably been judged negatively and told they're not good enough, and and so it's very hard to speak up and ask for help in the first place. But also, when you're a parent, you want to be this kind of great parent who's doing things better, and that it's really hard to admit even to ourselves that actually there are things that perhaps we can look at and that we might need some support with.
And survival is something that we know we can do that.
Yeah.
But being vulnerable, having that courage, in the words of Brené Brown, to be vulnerable, vulnerability meets danger.
Yeah.
So that's really tricky. And going back to postnatal depression, I personally am very interested in research, because I personally, intuitively, and it's something that I'm studying research at the moment as well in a degree, that I personally believe that postnatal depression can be linked to trauma.
100%. Mine was.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if at that point it's like society or the system suddenly goes, oh well, when we have a baby our hormones go a bit wild, and it's completely normal to have some kind of breakdown or depression, and it might be the first time that your feelings are legitimized as well. So it's not to say, it's about saying, well, okay, well, I am feeling a certain way, so we're validating ourselves perhaps for the first time. It's okay to have these feelings. I've got hormones that are raging, and I've just had a child, and my identity, I don't know what that is anymore. But even then it's still hard, because there's such a stigma that still exists around mental health, and it's getting better. It's getting better, but it still exists.
It's getting better, but there's still a lot of judgment. We see it all the time, even in if you're just talking about family dynamics and parent groups. Wow. I mean, I do feel for quite a few people that put things out and they're literally just asking for some advice. And the judgment is horrendous. So I'd like to change that around. Stop the judging.
And I think the other thing, talking about what happens when we become parents, is, sometimes we don't want to repeat the dynamics. So we end up going to the other extreme and actually doing exactly all the things that they're giving our children, all the things that we didn't get. And then we go into burnout, because actually, how can anyone offer that much to someone else? And they haven't even filled their own cup fully,
Absolutely. My white picket fence around the house, everything's spotless.
And then giving yourself a dressing down, a talking to, when you can't fulfill that ideal, and and keep all of that going when, you know, your lack of sleep, and you're not being a good mum even though you are, and you're not being the good wife even though you are, and you're not being the good work person but you are, you know, and everything is just spinning, and then one day you just can't keep doing it.
Yeah.
So,
you know, and actually that self-care is something that's so important when we become a parent.
Oh,
Because
you've come
in
to the
trauma
right
recovery in
place,
general,
Lisa.
isn't it? I mean, we have to start with ourselves. If we don't start with ourselves, we're not going to move very far. So
I always say that self-care is the simplest thing to do, because I always break it down to the smallest of things. About, you know, what's your cup like that you're drinking? What are you drinking? The real simple things. But it's the hardest thing to learn to implement into your life every day, but particularly when you need it.
Yeah.
100%.
But it's such a huge part of trauma recovery. You know, it's for me, it's the central part of trauma recovery, and learning kind of that you're human, and that being human means that we're not perfect, and that, you know, what we can do to support ourselves wherever we're at, you know, that we can give compassion to ourselves. But it's such a hard thing to do. But when we start taking those steps, that's when we're building our resilience. That's when we're empowering ourselves. You know, we're no longer giving our power away to others. So it's such a key part of the recovery.
Question for you, Lisa. When someone, a client, or just information in general, when someone truly feels that they're stuck and they can't move on and they self-sabotage, how do you help them through the therapies that you offer to even take that step forwards, because they are truly stuck and self-sabotaging?
Yeah, good question. I think it all depends on the individual, but there are
Yeah.
sort of one of the things that I like. So I also offer a range of what I guess would be classed as holistic therapies, because I'm a big believer in, when we experience trauma, we really somatize it. You know, it's in our body. Our brain goes offline. Our body is responding. The trauma is sometimes very stuck, and it's very deep. It's under layers and layers of other things. So sometimes talking therapy can really help. It can help with the awareness. It can help with moving things forward. But there are clients, especially those who've experienced sort of very deep trauma or abuse, where it can get a bit stuck in their system, or they can move to a certain point on their own, and then they can't go further than that. That's when I believe these other therapies can be really helpful, because we're starting to work with the energy. So we're helping the body, and you know all about this, Chris. I know it's part of your course, is how to kind of come back into regulation, how to get our mind back online when we've gone into that dysregulated state. So we can do some of that, but then we can also start to work on the deeper stuff. So what's blocking us? What are our blockages? Where are we kind of holding things? And sometimes there are things we can work with and that we can go deeper with. And sometimes there are things that are kind of beyond us. And this is where we're moving back into that kind of transpersonal realm. So, for example, the family constellations. It's the idea that, you know, we carry, and it's in our DNA, actually. You know, there's been a lot of studies done on how the unborn fetus or child, as they're growing, will feel the emotions of the mother. And of course, you've got to remember that those babies or those children were also in their grandmother, you know, because the eggs are there at the time in the uterus, in the fetus of in the baby.
Yeah.
So it's this idea that actually sort of epigenetics, it's this idea that things can affect us. Now, this all sounds quite scary, because, you know, ultimately when you're going through something big in your life, to then look at much bigger picture, again, too much too soon. But at the right time, if someone is feeling stuck, we can start to bring this stuff in. And then we're looking at, what are they carrying? What are they holding for, you know, their ancestors, their sort of family line? Are there patterns and dynamics within their family that are actually keeping them stuck? They've got like an unconscious, we call it blind love, you know, that we as children, we have blind love for our parents, and that, you know, sometimes we create these unconscious patterns and dynamics that aren't healthy for us, as ways of trying to either support the parent or just to find a way of being accepted and supported ourselves within those dynamics. So it's starting to unpack and look at all of that and actually let it go. But not in a sort of throwing it back way, not in a You know, because
Revengeful
we do a
way.
lot of that, you know, in the trauma recovery, we might do a lot of that. There's bound to be feelings of rage or anger or all sorts. Of course, we're doing all of that work first. But we come to a point then where we recognize that that's actually holding us back, because the resentment is eating us up. You know, it's still
Yeah.
stuck in us, and it's not hurting the other people anymore. It's hurting us.
No. Yeah.
And so it's
Absolutely.
about letting go of that somehow and handing it back, you know, energetically giving back what you've been carrying for that line or that
Yeah.
person system, so you can free up space in your psyche to move forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the bit that where we're in the survival mode and our body is built to survive. It holds on to certain memories. It doesn't file them away. It's like, I need these memories because I need to keep safe. And it's being able to actually unlock it and say, well, hold on, what about this other area, this other part of the brain that we've not been able to use or access?
But didn't we do well by having those coping strategies? Because ultimately they got us where we are. They kept us safe, and we needed them, and we never want to judge them or criticize them or get rid of them. I hear a lot of clients talking about, I want to get rid of this pattern or this thing. Yeah, we don't want to do that. We want to loosen its hold on us, but it's still useful. It's like, you know, we might still need it if we get into difficult dynamics in the future or difficult relationships. We might still need those parts of us to come into operation. So we don't want to get rid of them. We just want to see where they're self-sabotaging or holding us back, so that we then have a choice. It's about enabling a choice. Yeah.
And that's the scary bit sometimes.
Yeah.
Chris, I can see you've got a question to ask.
Yeah, I think you touched on it a bit already, Bev, but I was just going to ask Lisa, in her opinion, what does being in a dysregulated state even mean? Because some people might not understand what that looks like, what that feels like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're talking about sort of survival mode, really. I don't know if that's an easier way of understanding it, but it comes very much from, I know you cover this on your course, Chris, so I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'm saying
No, we're trying to educate other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's where we are not able to be in our kind of calm thinking state, you know, where we're not able to sit and think, you know, I can do this, or I could do that, or I'm not triggered. When we go into our triggered state, basically what's happening is our body thinks that we're in danger. So it goes into fight or flight, and it can be in any number of ways. You know, some people will talk about having panic attacks, people will talk about shallow breathing, they'll talk about sweating, they'll talk, you know, and it comes back to us we're mammals at the end of the day, and these are all very healthy responses to being in danger. The difference is we were supposed to recognize the danger and then remove ourselves from it. And then, you know, you see animals sometimes in the animal kingdom where they've been through it. I don't know, maybe there's a predator and they've managed to escape, and then they're or they've frozen, you know, they're in the freeze state.
Yeah.
Because that can happen a lot of the time. We freeze and we don't know what to do. And then they kind of shake it off. It's that somatic release that we talked about earlier. They shake it off, and then they carry on. They go back to their regulated state. And then that's what we're trying to achieve, because when we're in counselling or psychotherapy, we actually can't move until we've got people into the regulated state. We're helping them, we're giving them strategies to regulate their system so that they don't feel in danger, because whilst they're in danger, their brain is offline and they can't do the work. So yeah, it's all to do with the vagus now. I mean, there's much deeper, explanations, but I probably will. That's enough, right?
Can I just jump in here as well? And Beverley, you will have more information on this. So those 5 Fs, the responses, the fight, flight, which you've spoken about, and also the freeze, flop, friend, you'll often get some professionals who work with children and young people. When that child and young person is smiling, for example, that professional can perceive that as them being arrogant, as them laughing at them. But it's not, it's a befriending. It's a 5F. It's something that's going to keep, according to that young person, keep them safe, because if they smile, but it's deemed inappropriate.
Absolutely. So it's judged, or it's often that children are overlooked in their depression because they are presenting as happy children. But it's a false self. It's a safety mechanism that they're saying, I'm okay and everything's fine, but underneath it they're really not. You know, or they might be smiling and happy all the time, but they're not.
And Beverley, before you jump in, sorry. Neurodivergent people, okay, as well, they may be having trauma, but then their condition that they have, say it's ADHD, say it's autism, it mimics trauma symptoms as well. So sometimes if you're dealing with that kind of individual, you're not going to know because they don't know. And it's just like they might be presenting as a smiley person and you might think everything's okay, but behind that mask, there's God knows what's going on for them. And it's just like, have you ever come across someone like that? Both of you, this question's for. And how do you work out what is going on for them if they have got a neurodivergence to them?
Do you want to go first, Beverley?
Well, I love this bit because we're going into neurology as well, which is so important. I personally, knowing myself, I wanted to know some black and white facts. You know, when we were saying earlier, you said, Chris, you're a black and white person. I was totally, it's black or it's white. It's wrong or it's right. And there was no grey area. So if I could understand the science, the woo-woo bit, I wasn't interested in. Now I do understand the woo-woo bit because of the neuropsychology. But when you're thinking about, you know, adolescents, young adults, physically their brain hasn't completely developed. So the prefrontal cortex, this front part that us as adults and over about 25 have got, we can think about the logic, you know, we can to a certain extent self-regulate. Even if we've got trauma, we have the ability to there. But as a young person, you know, a teenager, adolescent, however you want to describe them, they haven't got that. It's not developed in their brain yet. So they're reacting all the time emotionally, and they will really be reacting from a survival point most of the time. And they don't know their identity. They know that their caregivers, they're naturally going to be coming away from them because they now want to be accepted as themselves within their own peer group, which is fantastic if it's a positive peer group. But sadly, it's about for the first time, they're making their choices without having always the understanding around them. And I say that because, Lisa, I also work in residential care with emotional behaviour. And I don't like the word behaviour because it sounds like they're bad or naughty, and it's not about that. And when you're able to meet a young person where they are, there's nothing better. And it's the simple things. And it's really, really challenging as well when they're so frightened and they're unable to connect with you on any level. So
they're so frightened because ultimately their experience of authority hasn't necessarily been positive. You know, so I another sort of probably should have said this earlier on, but after I started working as a counsellor, I then started and managed a youth counselling service for the best part, almost 10 years. And we were working with 11 to 25 year olds. And I'm really passionate about that age group because I think there's so much positive work we can do. Because if we can get to early intervention, then we're going to really help. You know, for me, I mean, there should be a counsellor in every school, but that's a whole other issue. We won't go down that route. BACP.
No, let's.
Yeah, and schools are getting better, don't get me wrong. They are much better at understanding that their emotions are driving behaviour now. They've got emotional coaching approaches, but schools are also another system that are completely under pressure, and they cannot hold the level of trauma or emotional need that exists in schools. So also some young people don't want to open up in schools or in places where they are known, and that's where these community-based services are great. But ours was a voluntary sector service, so we started with comic relief funding, and what was great about that was that it didn't have to be part of the official system. It didn't have to go via the NHS. You know, you could self-refer, or you could go via the NHS if you wanted to. We ended up creating a partnership with the CAM service within the borough, because there was no tier 2 service within the borough. And this is getting a bit technical, but ultimately what that meant, there was no service between the community support and the CAM service, which we know the waiting lists are huge and you have to have, you know, very high levels of need to access that service.
Yeah.
So this was bridging this kind of grey area where there wasn't support. But what it meant was it also enabled people to receive support outside of those formal settings. So they didn't want their parents to know necessarily. If they're 14 plus and they are what we class as competent to access support, they didn't even need to tell their parents. Unless, of course, if there's safeguarding concerns, we will be passing those on in the most appropriate way, but also empowering the young people in that process to have some control or some part of it. But it's giving them this sense that they don't have to conform to the system. They're getting choices. And if we're giving young people this young, I mean, that is so beneficial for the future, because choice, not having a choice, is one of the most challenging things that we all experience if we've had difficult dynamics in our life. You know, it takes away our ability to be autonomous and to move forward in a healing way, because we have to conform to the way that things are being done. So we've done lots and lots of work around, I don't know, going in and supporting as well when big things happen in schools, so that young people have someone that isn't their teacher or, you know, the person in the school that they can just go and drop in and talk to, and, you know,
and it's
one off.
It's so important as well, especially for young people that have learned, you know, come from very abusive families, you know, for whatever reason, whether that be physical abuse, whether that be emotional, whether it be sexual abuse, because they've learnt to survive and they've learnt to subdue their emotions to ensure they're safe. So then when they are in a safe environment, whatever that looks like, you know, we used to have the old-fashioned youth club, but that had that same benefit. But we find it, you know, and I obviously can't go into too much detail, but, you know, in residential areas, we're providing that safe space, which is fantastic. And when you start to see that young person come through, you then see the fear. It's like, whoa, hold on a minute. This is too good. Something's going to happen.
Yeah. And that's where, going back to that self-sabotage, that's where it comes in, because
Yes.
it's almost like, and we see it in every area, not just for young people, we see it in people that access support as adults as well, that at some point it's so unfamiliar and unknown, it starts to feel unsafe. And that's when these self-sabotaging behaviours start to come in. And if there is trust and safety, and we're building that kind of collaborative space, then we can work through that. But if they don't have that, that's the point at which we lose them, and then they don't get the support.
But
And
this is where sorry, Bev.
No, go Chris.
But this is where the system is not suitable for many trauma survivors of abuse, because if you don't turn up 1 week or 2 weeks, you then get written off, because it's like they're not committed, they're not showing up when they should. But that's not trauma-informed care to me, if you know, if these people can't turn up because something's going on for them on that day. Or going back to neurodivergence, those individuals find it astoundingly difficult to be on time, to be present, depends on what's going on for them. So they might have all of the intentions in the world to go there, be there, do this, do that, but it's their condition just doesn't allow for it.
Absolutely. So what we can start to do with that is we can start to bring it to their awareness, how it's actually impacting their life, but in a compassionate way, in a holding way, in a non-judgmental way. Start to say, have you noticed? And I'm curious about why, things like that. So they feel they're not being judged, they're not being told off, they're not being punished, or it's not punitive, but they are, you know, they're becoming aware, because sometimes they're not even aware of these patterns. Sometimes people are given a diagnosis and they then give up. Well, if I've got this diagnosis, then what's the point? And actually, the number of times that we've worked with people who, my belief is that there's a massive crossover, as you said earlier, between trauma and diagnosis. And of course, it's sometimes a very healthy way for our brains to keep us safe. And it ends up looking like a disorder, which someone's being then told, well, you can't get better from this. I think labels, you know, labels have a place, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be giving any labels at all, because in some cases it's really important and they're getting the support they need because of it, or even medication at times. But I think there's a lot of labeling that is really, really unhelpful, and it just empowers people, because it makes them believe they are in a box, they're there forever, and they lose the idea that they can empower themselves to move forward.
And it's our own fear as well, because of that judgment. You know, I'll put my hands up. I've just been diagnosed in the summer as dyslexic. Now, when I got that assessment, the emotion, because my label's always been Beverley could try harder. But it wasn't the fact that I can't learn it. It wasn't that I can't do it. It's just that I struggled to put it into writing how is expected. I can put it in my own language easy, but not in the expected way that's required, shall we just say. And now I've got that acknowledgement, I'm able to go forward with the right support. However, there's one label that I really resist, but I had to use it the other day. I said it's undiagnosed because it was something that they were going in for. And they were asking about trauma, etc. And I said, well, I suppose if I was to be diagnosed, I'd be diagnosed with CPTSD. I said, however, I don't have a formal diagnosis, and I've always worked hard with my wellbeing tools and my self-care, etc. And well, afterwards, I walked away, and the emotion, because I don't like the labels, because I think if I say that publicly, and I've said it now, someone's going to say, you can't do that.
So also, you're a really good example, Beverley, of how when we can recognise that these things that we're experiencing we can understand them, that it's not just that we don't try hard enough or we're not good enough, that actually there's a reason, that can actually be really healing. It can really support. So that's a great example of how diagnosis isn't necessarily always bad. There's no right or wrong in any of all of this. And one of the things that we do is we work with clients to see, what does a diagnosis mean for you? And even before that, what would it mean to go for diagnosis if the outcome was this or that? So that we're really giving them, that we're empowering them in the process of finding out ultimately. But it's not I love. It's just a thing, right? Like everything.
But I think the medical term disorder, I feel my whole body reacting. It's not a disorder. Yeah. It's something that's happened to enable you to keep safe. It's not a disorder. Yeah. Sometimes we disable.
And that flipping of what it is and isn't is really powerful when we're working with people to say, actually, aren't you amazing? Because you coped. And yes, this is your way of coping. And okay, maybe we want to look at finding healthier ways of coping, or we want to look at ways that are going to support you to move forward. But actually, aren't you amazing for still being here and having survived it and doing it in whatever way you could? And that is incredible. So we honour, where they are in their process. We don't see it as negative or bad. We have to applaud them for actually being there.
Absolutely. Oh, we're all passionate about this. Yeah. Chris, you're waiting there so patiently.
So I just wanted to add my 2 pence in here as well. So as you both said, the label, it's what it means to that person, because some people like the labels because they feel safe in their diagnosis. There's a reason why they are like they are. Like we've got individuals, for example, that we've known for many years that have got DID, dissociative identity disorder, and that has given them a lot of understanding as to why they may not be taking part fully in life, because if they're one particular identity over another identity, they don't know what's going on. Yeah. So the fact that they know that, they can live with that, and they can deal with that, they can plan for that. Whereas another friend of mine is no longer with us because she was given the diagnosis of bipolar disorder and she couldn't bear having that label. So as you both said, it can be serving or detrimental. I've actually got a diagnosis of complex PTSD, depression and anxiety. Yeah, I get the anxiety, but the other things, yeah, I've got it, but it doesn't define me. It doesn't stop me. I only got it so that I could go down the route of getting criminal injuries compensation, so that I could pay for EMDR, so that I could be free of all of this negative energy that was within my body that needed to be gone. And, and I've shared that so many times, but not put it maybe plainly in that way. But if I didn't need that diagnosis for the compensation scheme, I wouldn't have gone down that road because I don't want the labels. Yeah. So it really all depends on the person. And I also think that there are some young people that I've come across who want the label because they can see others who have the labels getting the help and support. And because they're undiagnosed, they then can't get the help and support until they've got the diagnosis. So it's almost like there's a pressure to conform to everyday societal norms when they know that they just can't do that. So it's almost like they need the label DSM, is it DSM-4, whatever it's called? They need that label in order to get access to the support, because this particular person that I'm speaking about couldn't have one-to-one counselling because they couldn't stabilise themselves. And the reason they couldn't stabilise themselves is because they're neurodivergent and no one picked up upon it. Yeah. But now we know all of that, we can get the right help and support. So often for many people, it is a journey as to what it is they can find that will help them or not help them. So again, we're going in a very grey area. It's not always black and white, which we like things to be. We like things to be tangible. But often you go through the abuse or the trauma, that's a fight in itself. Healing is often a fight. And getting any kind of help and support is a fight. And it's just, and there's so many people that come on the course, Lisa and Bev, that you know, that are just like, why do we have to do all of this work? Why? Over to you, girls.
I'm very mindful of time, and what I love in these conversations is the passion that comes through and where it leads us. And I know that people watching and listening really enjoy that when they feed that back, because they feel like they're actually here, and they're sometimes, they said that if they're watching a video, they find themselves like, yes, yes, yes. And personally, listening to it all, I think we should change it the other way. There is no normal life. And why can't we be compassionate to people and be person-centered all the time? That would be so lovely.
An ideal that we can all work towards, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Beverley, before you tell us time's up, because I don't want to hear it, quite frankly, okay. Lisa, you were telling us earlier that you do Reiki, you do EFT, you do sound baths, you do energy healing, you do family constellations. Can you just tell us a little bit about each of those things and why people might like to try them?
Yeah.
How long have we got?
3 minutes.
TikTok time. Okay, so yeah, well, I mean, I one of the things I love about offering these, so I used to keep them very separate, as I said. I used to think that, you know, there's a medical model and I won't be taken seriously if I offer these other things. I've really come into my own place of power in my professional practice now when I went private, and it's like, actually, I need to be, and this is really important when we're working with trauma as well, I need to role model what I believe works, you know, and be my authentic self so that I can support others to do the same. And for me, that was kind of bridging a gap, bringing these two things together in the same way that, you know, in my previous practice, I brought, you know, CAMS and the voluntary sector together more by creating the partnership. This is about going, okay, these things have a place. They're not for everybody, but I've had people come in who are more open to the sort of what they call woo-woo stuff, and then they've ended up in counselling or psychotherapy. So it's going to read into that. And I've had other people come the other way. They've done years and years and years of trauma work. They see my website and they go, I just really love this idea that I can move beyond it. And we're still working with the trauma, absolutely we are, and it will crop up and we deal with it when we need to, but we're actually working towards moving beyond it as well. So we're trying to sort of clear and bring something new through. And so what these modalities can do is it can really help with that process. It's about clearing, it's about creating space, it's about unblocking, but it's not about bypassing. It's not about we're going to go into all this woo stuff and we're not going to look at the reality or the trauma at all. It isn't that. And that's one of the things that I think is really nice, that to be able to offer a space where people can do whatever is right and needed for them in the moment. And it might chop and change. You know, they might go to one, and then I've got a client who comes and every now and again will say, can I have Reiki in the next session? I'm like, yeah, of course, let's do that then, because it's where they're at and what they need in that moment. So it becomes more holistic.
So Reiki is hands-off healing, isn't it?
Can be hands on or off, but yeah, It's very relaxing. Ultimately, they're all about relaxing you so that we're letting go. We're moving into that regulated state. We're moving into the place where we can heal. Ultimately, we are not doing the healing. We're creating the environment for healing to happen.
EFT's tapping, yes.
Yes, tapping, yeah.
And
so
then sound,
it's helping the body move into the regulated state by releasing the stress and tensions. It's much deeper. And then the sound bowls, they've actually, it's incredible. They're using them in like prenatal, what's it called? When they've had the baby.
Care? Oh, postnatal.
Postnatal care, thank you. My brain block. And because what they're doing is they're recognizing that these frequencies and the vibrations are actually very healing. It's like our natural state is energy. You know, we are energy at our core, and that these things can really support and help healing process, the body's natural healing process. So yeah, lots and lots of things. And I also do lots of partnerships as well now, so I can keep my hat on in the community. So I run women's support group, and I do mindfulness walk and talks with other organisations. But maybe I can give you some information about that, and you can attach it in a comment or something. So if people want to see more, they can.
Absolutely, Lisa, we will do. And for anybody that would like more information, you can always email breaking the cycle 2stepforward@gmail.com. And again, those links will be underneath. And I am going to say we've got a minute each to wrap up with final thoughts. And so sorry, but I know you've got to go off and you've got commitments, Lisa, as well. So we want to be mindful of that. So, Chris, while Lisa's got a chance to think about it, what comes to your mind that you just last thing on your mind that you'd like to say to wrap this all up?
I think the messaging today from me is just keep your minds open to different modalities of healing. If something's not working for you, something is out there that will work for you. And also to the professionals who may be listening, be aware of the 5 F's of trauma response and understand what that child and young person is actually telling you verbally and non-verbally about what is going on for them.
Thank you. And Lisa, final word from yourself.
Oh, I'm feeling very energized. It's been really lovely chatting to you two. As you can see, I can be quite passionate about these subjects. So
we love that.
I'm aware of all the things we haven't been able to say yet. So maybe I'll have to come back for part 2 in the future.
Yeah,
everyone's invited back. Yeah, always welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's been really a pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And for my final word, I just want to say to anybody, if it's a bit scary, just bring it down and actually don't look at all these other modalities as I've done it, tick, I'm moving onwards. You know, it really is about giving yourself space and taking time to listen to yourself. So I hope today has given you another insight, or we hope it's given you another insight into different aspects of healing, finding your own pathway, how you want your life to look. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts and your feedback after you've watched or listened to this episode. So thank you very much. It is time to say goodbye. And I'm the bearer of bad news, but bye-bye, everybody, and thank you.
See you soon. Bye.